Morning and welcome to the review of the day. But in passing, I'm going to mention that behind me you can, or regular viewers will notice that I am once again in front of my original bespoke bookshelf. The new one is over that direction and I was sitting there last time. So upcoming, I hope to do a review of my ongoing attempts to alphabetize my entire book collection, or at least 90% of my book collection. I'll try and do a whole video on that, but I've been putting it off because I don't have a selfie stick. I think that's what they call them. And these videos tend to be very shaky and very amateurish, and I really don't want to do this to you, my kind viewers and commenters. Anyhow, the book of the day is He Died with the Falafel in His Hand by John Birmingham. This is kind of an iconic Australian book. And this seems to be also my year for rereading a lot of humour, which isn't normally heavily on my radar. But John Birmingham, as you can see here, it is the 30th anniversary edition. And if you're Australian, you almost certainly know the name of He Died with the Falafel in His Hand, either for the book or the movie, or more likely both. People who are into Australian writing and Australian literary endeavours, I suppose, probably know John Birmingham. I believe he even does podcasts these days, but he's been involved in a lot of things. I think in his social justice aspect, he's known as being, I think it was one of the last people ever arrested in Queensland under freedom of speech issues. Oh, I've got to find that. It's such a funny story. Anyhow, so this is a book that I'm not reading for the first time. Oh, that's it. While he was a law student, he was a student many times, many of which are in this book. He was one of the last people arrested under the state's anti-street march legislation, because Queensland is Queensland and we actually had that until relatively recently. Birmingham was convicted of displaying a sheet of paper with the words "free speech" written on it in very, very small type. And the local newspaper carried a photograph of him being frog-marched off to a waiting police paddy wagon. And those images may well have been some of the nails in the coffin of that act, because if you can be arrested for holding a piece of paper with two small words on it, where's it going? Queensland's got a lot of these ridiculous old laws, and some of them are still on the books and some of them are still being defeated. It's one of the things that if you were born in Queensland, you may well cringe over, but if you came to Queensland later, like myself, you find it hysterically funny. John Birmingham himself was born in Queensland. He was born in Ipswich, just out of Brisbane. And if you know Brisbane at all, you just learnt so much more about him than I could explain in a video of the length which YouTube will allow. Ipswich has never been the most salubrious area. It's going a bit upmarket now, but when he was born, probably less so. I believe Birmingham lives in Brisbane again. But during the period when he wrote, researched and put together this book, he was living as a share house. I think they call it roommates in the USA, but I'm not certain about that. I believe that in England they also call it share housing. But essentially what it was is when a lot of people were too poor to rent a place in their own name, or they didn't have the credit rating for real estate to accept them, they would just join in one of the huge old Queenslanders or other houses that Australia is known for, each rent a room by price and share bills. And as anyone who has done any of that will know, this can be a hysterical experience. It can be all the emotions, most of them negative, occasionally nice. You're going to have to share with people you don't know, you don't like, you don't understand, and you don't want to understand. All you want is them gone. And they probably feel the same about you. Now, when I first read this book, apparently 30 years ago, when was it first published? It was first published, the internet will tell me this, I'm sure. Oh, actually, the book will tell me this. It was published before the internet was there, in the same sense that it is there today. And I had a book back then. 98? Late 90s. In the late 90s, I was share housing and had been for a while. I went to uni, which meant you didn't have a lot of money. There was share housing. There was share housing before it, and there was share housing after it. Aside from the period when I was at uni, I was never a really dedicated share houser in the way that Birmingham and his friends were. For them, it was basically the way of life. You moved out of your parents' house and you moved into a share house. And some of them were working and some of them were on the dole. And some of them, quite a few of them, were taking drugs. Some of them were students and so on Austudy, which is far below a living wage and always was, as I can tell you, having been on it. And in this book, you have a long line of all the strangenesses that can happen in a share house. But what really makes this a marvellous book is Birmingham's writing. Birmingham can take something that is normal and everyday and make it quite funny. So he can take something that's way off the cuff and make it hysterically funny. So I owned this book back in the day and I read it and I enjoyed it. It left with an ex-boyfriend. And recently, thank you Beck, I received this copy. I tripped over it, actually it was delivered while I was at work and I tripped over it in the dark trying to get home. And I've just read it. It was great fun. As much fun as it was then. As a reissue, he's got a few, as he calls it here, now with incriminating footnotes. They're not so very incriminating, and the laws have some of the laws have changed anyway. But he's got these added notes that I don't remember from the first one. He'll tell an absolutely ridiculous story about someone that just leaves you shaking your head and laughing in belief, disbelief. And then he'll follow it up with a note like, for example, I can't see one, Jimmy now works for the federal police. And his hobby is trying to chase down the old roommates. So things like that. Now, there's a whole heap. The comic artist Ryan Vella produced the cover of the book, I believe. He's got a whole heap of commentary about younger people and Gen Zs, I can never remember the generations, whatever. The younger people, yes. Yes, kids, in before times our handouts arrived in the form of an actual paper note from the bank, promising to exchange said document for a Hessian bag full of salt beef and hardtack. What he's actually referring to, of course, is the dole check. The Centrelink wasn't called Centrelink back then. Can't remember what it was called. They would give you a check. You would take it to the bank would give you money in return for it. Not very much, but, you know, better than nothing. These days, of course, it's all electronic, and that's what that footnote is talking about. The foreword starts you off well, if you remember this book from times gone by. Hello, I'm sorry you're so old, but I don't make the rules. This book was first published 30 years ago, and that's likely when you read it. Or maybe you were a bit slow and you got around to skimming the copy you stole from your flatmate 26 or 27 years ago. You're still old. Lean into it. And I am. I'm old. I find it difficult to believe it was 30 years ago when I first read this book, but it always reinforces some of the memories of share housing experiences. So there's a double nostalgia there. There's the nostalgia of reading the book and enjoying it so much in the time. Back in the days when maggots would still appear in sinks of share houses, like, thank God that's never going to happen to me again. I hope it's never going to happen to me again. But there's also the nostalgia of reading the book back then, but also the nostalgia of reading the book and thinking back to them. And the maggots that may never be my lot again, I hope. So, Birmingham's writing is the real joy about this. You've got a long list of fascinating characters, like Melissa, who ran a scam from the share house under the name of Mr. Cochrane and then abdicated with her boyfriend to another country. Asian woman who they called Satomi Tiger because they knew nothing about her at all, turned up in the living room one day with bags and said, I move in now. She lived there for a while, and then one day she appeared in the living room and said, I go now, and that's pretty much all he's got about her. And there's one passage on page 2 that I really loved. We'd sit around on Tuesday night waiting for Melissa to get home with our stolen dinner from the place where she worked. She usually walked through the door just before Twin Peaks came on, so there was this nice warm feeling in the house as we all sat in front of the TV, scarfing down the free stuff. On a good night, when someone's cheque had come through, we'd have a couple of beers to share around, and on a great night when someone, usually Melissa, had scored, we'd pull out the back bucket bong and get completely whacked. On those nights, that nice warm feeling was really close. It wrapped you up like your dad's old jumper and kept you safe. On those nights, you could delude yourself that share housing, which is all about deprivation and economic necessity, was really about something else, a friendly sort of half-sensible descendant of the communal ideal. But it never lasts, never holds together. Someone always moves in, or loses their mind, or dies with a falafel in his hand, in your beanbag, and you're on the road again. And someone did actually die in John Birmingham's beanbag. Though he tells us in this book it wasn't actually a falafel, it was a chicken shawarma, but his editor thought he needed to do something more catchy. It's just really 154 pages of hilarity and joy and pleasant writing. That includes the notes. This is a book where I read all the footnotes and all the notes because they were as much fun as the book itself. So, any Australian reading this who's of my age or a bit younger or is moving into the new generation of share housing which is coming through again as rent becomes a problem, you will probably enjoy this a great deal. And anyone who is not Australian but fascinated by all things Australiana, maybe you need to watch the movie first if you don't know what a hills hoist is. Or maybe Google will be your friend. But in any case, I do thoroughly recommend He Died with a Falafel in His Hand. John Birmingham's other work is pretty good. I've read a couple of them. I don't have them on my shelves right now. But this one is really hysterically funny at times. And there's the movie. I saw the movie after I'd read the book. And so I was doing that thing which many of us do where we're going, it didn't happen that way as we're watching the movie. The lineup for the movie, I think it was Noah Taylor as the main dude, and he did a pretty good job. Yeah, Noah Taylor, Emily Hamilton, Sophie Lee, a whole heap of other people, and it was fun enough. But there's things that you just can't do in a movie that you can get away with in a book, and they're all in here. What have we got? Have we got any contents warnings? If you're scared of cockroaches, there's one scene here that will plague you and may give you nightmares. Birmingham himself realised when he was editing for this edition that he calls women girls a lot in it. And he says that he thought maybe he should go back and edit them out. Then he found out there were so many of them and he just left it. And we can deal with it or not as we choose. This is so much the Brisbane scene, but it's also a little bit the Melbourne scene, and it's also a little bit the Sydney scene. And I've known share houses in all those locations and a few more besides. So thank you, John Birmingham, though I imagine you will never ever watch this, for a great book that I loved apparently 30 years ago. Oof, oof. But I still love it today. And this edition I'm going to keep my hands on, and I will probably reread it in a couple of years, come back with new insights on how much I enjoyed it. And I hope this inspires at least one or two people to either read the book or at least download, legally, of course, no pirating is allowed, the movie from the internet and have a good laugh on John Birmingham and me. And thank you for watching.